So what's the solution to global warming? Well, there's one and only one time that mankind ever had partial success in reversing global warming. Not in some aspirational greenwashing or some computer-rendered vaporware, but demonstrably effective on a planet-wide scale for some 40 years between about 1940, after World War II, and 1980. So this is the core of it. The grey line there is the carbon dioxide emissions from mankind, and you can see the huge spike after World War II. And what does global temperature do in response to this? Well, this is the key region here. This is where mankind actually managed to reverse the warming effect from carbon dioxide on a planet-wide scale. It is the only time mankind has even remotely approached reversing global warming. Well, great, we just need to do that again, right? Then all will be well with the world. Well, yes and no. We regret to inform mankind that by the time such a solution is being seriously thought of and implemented, things will be utterly desperate for mankind, like grasping at straws desperate. If you're watching this video when it goes up, it probably won't be in your lifetime. So before coming on to the solution, let's deal with the scope of the problem. So in my previous video, I explained that fossil fuels were basically used because they are the absolute king of cheap, safe energy density. We basically use exactly the same stuff to run our cars today as we did 100 or so years ago. And I've really got to stress this for those optimists hoping for some magic bullet solution for a problem that is fundamentally magic bullet proof. Some technologies you can make 1,000,000 times better, and those can revolutionize your civilization. Like you can make a transistor 1,000,000 times smaller, or liquid crystal, capacitive touchscreens, and so forth. Energy density is not one of those problems. We do use almost exactly the same internal combustion engines, burning almost exactly the same product as we did 100 or so years ago. And those numbers ain't gonna change because the thermodynamics ain't gonna change. The carbon dioxide that you get from burning a liter or a gallon of gas, of fossil fuel, you might not see it because it's a gas, but if you could liquefy or solidify it, you would get a liter or a gallon of solid carbon dioxide for every liter or gallon of gasoline that you burn. And because fossil fuels are so cheap and good for energy density, we've built up a huge infrastructure around using them. Refineries, pipelines, power stations, and the such like. None of that will be cheap or quick to replace. Even if you had the will, the plan, and the money, you would still be looking at decades. And this is, of course, assuming that you actually want to do it. And this is one of the key factors to bear in mind. You will have to retire billions of dollars of old infrastructure. And people who own part of those assets might not really want to become poorer. After all, who does? But we will probably be the last generation that can mostly ignore climate change. But the bill for the damage from global warming will likely go up with this graph. And this is now 40 years of line go up. And we've just got out of the warmest summer on record. By the way, yeah, get used to saying that, hottest year on record. And the bill's not going to be cheap. Currently, we only have the teaser trailer for global warming. And mankind's response thus far has been, meh, come back when it's a disaster. Current climate fuel disasters cost America about $165 billion per year, give or take 10 times the operating budget of NASA. What are we doing to combat this? Currently, the whole carbon credits thing seems overwhelmingly a greenwashing game, mostly on the scammy side, and sort of obviously so. Like if I have a forest I claim I was going to cut down and didn't, I can claim that those are carbon credits because they would have been released as carbon dioxide. Even though the forest was never going to be cut down and was never actually cut down, I can still sell them as carbon credits, so people who emit carbon dioxide can claim that they're net zero. Let me put this in more simple terms. I can pretend to fly around the world and then say I'm going to cancel my flight, and then I can sell that as a carbon emissions offset to, say, myself for $1, and then fly around the world and claim that it's net zero. And there is the fundamental problem. Carbon credit companies that actually want to capture carbon dioxide will have a cost associated with that. Meanwhile, if you want the cheapest carbon credits on the market, they're likely to be greenwashing vaporware. And if you're running a company that wants to claim to be carbon zero, well, fine, you just buy the cheapest carbon credits on the market. Basically, it's all business as normal with slight greenwashing overheads, so people can feel like they've made a contribution. It's basically team trees. And yeah, lots of people still think that growing trees is a solution. Spoiler, not even close. The dimensions in reality, carbon dioxide emissions from mankind are some 50-odd billion tons per year. Now, people don't visualize that sort of thing very well, so a cubic meter of carbon dioxide gas, that's this sort of volume, if you were to liquefy it or solidify it, doesn't really matter, will give you about a litre, which will weigh about 2 kilos. Now, the Freedom Tower is one of the tallest buildings on Earth. It's about half a kilometre tall, so a cubic kilometre would be about twice the height of the Freedom Tower in every direction. One of those is 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide, and so if you were to stack mankind's emissions up into the air, it would go up some 20 kilometres. Airlines, for reference, fly at about 10 kilometres. Now, someone look at this and say, well, that's for the whole planet, and the planet's a big place. Not so bad, right? And then you start thinking about it. The Freedom Tower is one of the tallest buildings in the world. Took about a decade to build. And this column would be made of solid carbon dioxide, about the same density as concrete. And there's a pause, and it's like, okay, maybe that is actually quite a lot of stuff. And bear in mind, that's merely for a year. Now, thankfully, the planet's covered 2/3 with water, which is pretty good at dissolving this stuff, but it doesn't buffer all of it. Ballpark figures, about half of it dissolves in the oceans, and the rest that remains in the atmosphere is what's increased the carbon dioxide content of our atmosphere by about 30%. But that massive buffer of carbon dioxide dissolved in the oceans will work against you the second you try to start reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Because just like it's really saving on bacon at the moment by basically dissolving carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, once you start trying to reduce the carbon dioxide, it'll start pumping that carbon dioxide out of that buffer and back into the atmosphere. Now, it doesn't look like there's any credible chance of that happening in my lifetime. As if we look at it historically, line just goes up, bar a blip from COVID. But rest assured, humans alive decades to centuries from now will have to deal with this. And if you want to know why trees are sort of operationally ineffective at this sort of thing, wood stores carbon dioxide at roughly half the density of solid carbon dioxide, but whatever, we'll call it the same. So basically, you need to create this much tree trunk every year to offset mankind's carbon footprint. Every year. And let's just remind ourselves of the scale here. That scrotty little thing at the bottom there, that's the Freedom Tower. And if we zoom in on the Freedom Tower, you see those scrotty little things next to the Freedom Tower. Those are trees. And then you've got to store that somewhere, basically indefinitely, because otherwise that wood will just rot and be released back into the atmosphere. Or a decent forest fire, and you're back to square one. So that 50-odd gigatons is dumped directly into our atmosphere. Now, capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is basically a non-starter. It's way too expensive at current energy prices. And those current energy prices are determined by mostly cheap energy from burning fossil fuels. Now, you have options here, like move to a non-fossil fuel economy. But this, of course, takes time. After all, you have trillions of dollars invested in the infrastructure. Now, for electricity generation, basically not cars or planes, that sort of thing, it's actually fairly cost effective. And this is why the European Union, and to a less degree America, is actually making progress in not increasing their carbon dioxide emissions. There are economically superior green electricity generating options. Transport's a little trickier. Solar and wind are good in the right venue, but are erratic and need energy storage. Hydro is good for sustainable power and storage of energy, but needs hills or mountains. Nuclear is a fantastic backbone for an energy economy. but has long build times and is expensive to build, primarily due to people being irrationally scared of nuclear power, in part due to utterly fictitious claims like this in HBO's Chernobyl.
When the lava enters these tanks, it will instantly superheat and vaporize approximately 7,000 cubic meters of water, causing a significant thermal explosion.
Yep, every word of that was bullshit.
Everything within a 30-kilometer radius will be completely destroyed.
That's especially bullshit.
Including the 3 remaining reactors at Chernobyl. The entirety of the radioactive material in all of the cores will be ejected at force and dispersed by a massive shockwave.
Look, nuclear reactors cannot blow up like nuclear bombs. Nuclear bombs need to be precisely engineered and have microsecond timing. You cannot get that sort of explosion out of a nuclear reactor. And especially not by just pouring water on a melted down nuclear reactor. Something that is fundamentally designed to be a glorified water boiler.
Approximately 200 kilometers and likely be fatal to the entire population of Kiev as well as a portion of Minsk.
In reality, they've had what was probably the biggest explosion they could get by a thermal runaway on a poorly designed nuclear reactor, and it was just about enough to blow the reactor building, which didn't actually have a containment vessel, like all the other nuclear reactors, because the Soviet design was so good that it couldn't fail and didn't need a containment vessel. Which is why when you look at it, the roof's basically being blown off the building. Not quite a nuclear explosion. For comparison, the Hiroshima bomb, one of the smallest nukes ever made.
The release of radiation will be severe and will impact all of Soviet Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarusia.
No. Someone tell her to stop.
As well as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and most of East Germany.
What do you mean, impact?
It's going to become one of the largest nature reserves in Europe.
For Belarusia and the Ukraine, impact means completely uninhabitable for a minimum of 100 years.
Indeed, it turns out that the radiation levels recorded directly outside the plant where this disaster happened can be so low that they are comparable to those that you would get cruising on a commercial jet. And the latter measurement I can personally vouch for, as I measured it myself.
For much of the area, a nearly permanent disruption of the food and water supply. Steep increase in the rates of cancer and birth defects.
In reality, Chernobyl was the worst case disaster that you get from people doing stupid things to a poorly designed reactor. And what's the result of this worst disaster in history? One of the best preserved wilderness areas on the planet. Turns out a little extra radiation and no people is far better for the wildlife than people with merely background radiation. Look, you get 30 times background radiation when you're on a plane at altitude. And the radiation levels that they have around Chernobyl, it's actually difficult to detect any effects that it has on the wildlife. I mean, just to give you some idea of where we could be at the moment. For some 40 years, France has been generating about 70% of its electricity from nuclear, which is roughly half of the total energy used by the country. Basically, if we'd all switched to nuclear back then, we would have about half the carbon footprint now. And is France's electricity desperately expensive because of this? Nah, it's about average. Now, having seen the way things are going, and knowing a little about human psychology, Nash equilibrium, that sort of thing, things will only change when things get desperate. Sea level rise is a creep, a metre or two per century, and it's difficult to feel a great sense of urgency when the century that Star Trek The Next Generation occurs in appears on a graph. That's kind of outside the reach of my lively concerns. But even the metre or so increase we're looking at by the end of the century, it's enough to flood significant portions of Manhattan. And even a fraction of that is going to be bad news for millions of people. More serious concerns are things like changing temperatures means changing weather patterns. And newsflash, our entire food infrastructure is based around those not changing. Crop failures due to changing water supplies are most likely an inevitability. that's going to be a problem for food security. Now, will mankind be quick enough to respond to this and grow food elsewhere? I don't know. But I do expect that the human larder doesn't extend much more than a year or so. So 2 years of bad crops and money doesn't really mean that much anymore.
Have you ever been in a city under siege? Maybe this part's not in your books. Food's worth more than gold. Noble ladies sell their diamonds for a sack of potatoes.
But honestly, it's difficult to contrive that I'm going to live long enough to actually see any sort of food insecurity like that. Maybe just the teaser trailer. So to the core of it, what happened here? Why did global temperatures stall after the burst of industrialization after World War II? The simple answer is dirty industry. They created lots of pollutants other than carbon dioxide, and those pollutants actually had a cooling effect that offset the heating from the carbon dioxide. Clean Air Acts were passed, and over the period of a decade or so, those pollutants washed out of the atmosphere. So one, albeit temporary solution to global warming, is just revoke all of the Clean Air Acts. Yeah, I know, hardly optimal, but can we do any better than this? Well, yes. Yes, we can. You see, stuff washes out of the atmosphere at different rates at different altitudes. You only get rain clouds lower than the height planes fly at, the troposphere-stratosphere interface, that sort of thing. Incidentally, most of the mass of the atmosphere is lower down, so by the time you get up to where the planes fly, at some 10 kilometers, you've lost 3/4 of the atmosphere. So 3/4 of the mass of the atmosphere is below 10 kilometers and only about 1/4 of it above. So in the lower atmosphere where you get rain clouds, stuff washes out of the atmosphere pretty quickly, especially the highly soluble water stuff like sulfur dioxide. And if released into the lower atmosphere, sulfur dioxide washes out locally, creating acid rain. But at higher altitudes where there isn't that rain, it's much more persistent. We know this because volcanoes throw lots of pollutants very high into the atmosphere, and you can measure how long they take to come down. So basically, ideally, you want cooling pollutants, the right sort of aerosol. But to be effective as long as possible, you can't release them into the lower atmosphere because they'll just wash out very quickly. You need to get them into the upper atmosphere, which is not as simple as it sounds. And you want them to be effective for as long as possible, which sadly will never be as long as your heating pollutants. The current best chance is stratospheric aerosol injection. Also a martial art weapon. The only option on the table all along. Ooh, Easter eggs. Sulfur dioxide is a good candidate, which is basically exactly the same stuff that gives you acid rain in the lower atmosphere. But of course, once you get much higher where the air is thinner and you don't have clouds like that, it lasts much longer. Now eventually it will end up getting back into the lower atmosphere where it'll acidify things, but it won't be an intense local phenomena like acid rain, but a weak global phenomena. Now, merely just getting the stuff up there is quite a challenge. You can't just inject the stuff into the lower atmosphere and keep your fingers crossed, because it'll just wash out locally as acid rain. Getting into the upper atmosphere, we're talking higher than where the planes fly, isn't that easy. But it's a heck of a lot more plausible at scale than anything else that's been suggested. And maybe more importantly, it's the only thing that's ever been demonstrated to actually work. Now, it's got to be said that basically spraying sulfuric acid into the atmosphere is a suboptimal solution. But sulfur dioxide ain't the only thing that will give you cooling aerosols. Now, other proposals have suggested things like calcium carbonate, which is basically harmless. But even though it's the only thing that's been shown to work, people tend to hate it. Now, the thing is, people have this weird blind spot for geoengineering. They don't see the release of gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as geoengineering. Well, maybe because engineering suggests that you're trying to do something on purpose. So, accidentally releasing gigatons into the atmosphere is not engineering. It's a geo-cock-up. And maybe the best solution to a cock-up is some actual engineering. And if it's a global cock-up, then, the only way to correct it is going to be by geoengineering. Now, aerosol cooling is a relatively short-lived thing compared to carbon dioxide. We know that the sulfates from the aerosols typically only live years versus the decades to centuries for the carbon dioxide. but it does give you some throttle ability on the whole thing, in that if you're not satisfied with the results, you can stop and you'll be back to cooking on the planet in a decade or so. Bottom line is, stratospheric aerosol injection is a stopgap measure, but one of the few that can be implemented relatively cheaply. I mean, we're still talking billions of dollars that someone will have to pay at some point. I mean, just some rough idea of scale. The air industry currently puts out about 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, so it's burning about half of that, 500 million tons of fuel. The rough amount of aerosols you would need to plateau global warming is about 5 million tons. So hand-waving away a lot of important details. The planes basically fly up to the stratosphere, and a 1% additive to their fuel or whatever would basically plateau global warming for you. Sure, it's not going to be that easy in the details, but you can see for a potential solution, the scale is accessible. And yeah, there will be a cost associated to this of billions of dollars. But when that's versus a climate change bill that will likely run into the trillions, it's a bargain. Now, this is never going to happen, of course, till things get desperate. You know, basically for the same reason that people clutch their pearls about nuclear. You know, people who pumped billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the planet's atmosphere will be ranting about poisoning the planet. Yeah, sure, bud. 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide say nothing. A few million tons of sulfur dioxide, N times. And if you want to know what 1 million tons of sulfur dioxide looks like on this sort of scale, it's approximately the volume of the Freedom Tower. Those are the sort of dimensions we're talking here. Look, it's an emergency stopgap. It's the only thing left on the table. And even at that, it's not a solution. It's a patch that can stave off disaster and maybe give you a little more time to reduce your carbon dioxide emissions. In the meanwhile, the line will just keep going up, and you can expect climate-related disasters to keep going up as well. With the Nash equilibrium in mind, it's not going to be till your average person has experienced enough blowback themselves to realize that they're willing to take more severe action that things will actually start to happen. And by that time, people might be desperate enough to take a look at this video seriously.